Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today I have yet another Intel Alder Lake CPU review for you, and this time we're looking at the Core i7 12700KF. Now, the reason why I have the KF version is because that's all that was available to me. Intel didn't sample the Core i7 model, so we've had to go and buy it, and of course that's exactly what we've gone and done. For those of you wondering, the 12700KF and 12700K are the exact same CPU with the minor exception of the Intel UHD Graphics 770, which has been disabled on the KF version. But other than that, as I said, they are exactly the same. Well, actually, that and the price. The 12700K is currently retailing for $450 US, while the KF model is slightly cheaper at $430 US. And that means these parts are competing directly with AMD's Ryzen 7 5800X, which features an MSRP of $450 US, but it is currently down to around $390 US. In terms of specifications, the 12700K series packs 12 cores in total, made up by 8 performance cores with 4 efficient cores for 20 threads. So that's a very similar configuration to that of the Core i9 models, but with 4 fewer E-cores. That said, the L3 cache capacity has also been downgraded from 30 megabytes to 25 megabytes, so that's a 17% decrease there. And then we see a very minor reduction in turbo clock frequencies, with the 12700KF boosting to 4.9 GHz for the P cores and 3.8 GHz for the E cores. These downgrades mean that the maximum turbo power rating has been reduced from 241 watts to 190 watts, a fairly substantial 21% power saving. The rest of the specs remain the same, so 20 PCIe lanes from the CPU, 16 of which are the newer PCI Express 5.0 specification. And again, both DDR4 and DDR5 memory technologies are supported, though not simultaneously and not by the same motherboard, so you'll have to pick in advance which type of memory you'd like to use. The stock memory support includes either DDR4 3200 or DDR5 4800, and recently I looked at DDR5 6000 performance with the Core i9 12900K and found that for the most part this new high-speed memory offers very little in the way of extra performance when paired with an Alder Lake CPU. And this led me to conclude that just about all potential 12th gen customers should ignore DDR5 and just go with the significantly cheaper and easier to find DDR4. That being the case, I'm not going to invest time testing the 12700KF with DDR5. If you want to see what that memory technology delivers, then check out the 12900K review. As for the motherboards, I've again gone with the MSI Z690 Tomahawk Wi-Fi DDR4 for testing the 12th gen Core series processors in this review. Now, due to the hybrid core design of Alder Lake, the 12700KF, along with most of the 12th gen processors, require Windows 11 and its improved thread scheduler for optimal performance. Therefore, I've tested using a fresh install of Windows 11. That being the case, I felt compelled to do the same for all other test systems, especially after discovering that Ryzen gaming performance is typically a little faster using the more modern operating system. So all of the data featured in this video is fresh and has been collected over the last week and a half. The Ryzen test system uses the Asus ROG Crosshair 8 Dark Hero motherboard with the latest BIOS revision installed, and of course all the latest Windows updates and drivers have also been installed. Finally, the last test system note worth mentioning is the fact that all application and gaming data has been collected using the AMD Radeon RX 6900 XT graphics card. Okay, I think that covers everything. Let's dive into the results. Starting with Cinebench R23, you find some rather brutal results for AMD. Here the 12700KF is seen delivering almost 50% more performance than the 5800X and 54% more than its predecessor, the 11700K. In fact, the new 12th gen Core i7 processor was 11% faster than the 5900X, a part that currently costs 25% more. Then we see that the 12700KF was 17% slower than the 12900K, which is a pretty decent margin, and this will be the result of those missing E-cores along with the smaller L3 cache and the slightly lower operating frequencies, but still an incredible result, especially given the 12700KF is a little over 30% cheaper than the 12900KF. As expected, the single-core performance is also very mighty. Here we're measuring P-core performance, and this places the 12700KF at a 23% performance advantage when compared to the 5800X. Moving on to the 7-zip file manager compression performance, and here the 12700KF is comparable to the 10900K and 11900K, making it just 3% slower than the 12900K and 5% slower than the 5800X, so a less impressive result overall. Then when it comes to decompression work, the 12700KF and 5800X are dead even, making them both around 17% slower than the 12900K. Here we see that the Core i7 processor proves to be a beast in the Corona benchmark, delivering 30% greater performance when compared to the 5800X. In fact, it was just 9% slower than the 5900X and 17% slower than the 12900K. So a very solid result overall, and again, this puts AMD in a tough position where they might be forced to slash pricing. Here we see that the Core i7 12700KF destroys in the Adobe Premiere Pro 2021 benchmark with a score of 984 points, and that made it 10% faster than even the 12900K. I'm not quite sure how that's even possible. Perhaps the higher E-core count of the Core i9 part is to blame here, feeding them work in favor of the P-cores. So this could just be a simple scheduling issue, as there's really no reason for the 12700KF to be faster. But whatever the case, Intel crushes AMD in this benchmark, as the 12700KF was 34% faster than the 5800X. The Ryzen 7 5800X does fare better in the Photoshop benchmark, but even so, the 12700KF was still 7% faster with a score of 1312 points, making it just 4% slower than the 12900K. The 12700KF also performed very well in Adobe After Effects, producing a score of 2108 points, which placed it ahead of the Ryzen 9 5900X and just behind the 12900K. So, a super result there, and it also meant that it was 8% faster than the Ryzen 7 5800X. Factorio is a new addition to our battery of benchmarks, and this simulation game hasn't been included with the rest of the games, as we're not measuring frames per second, but rather updates per second. This automated benchmark calculates the time it takes to run 1,000 updates, and this is a single-threaded test, which apparently relies heavily on cache capacity. As you can see, the new Core i7 performs exceptionally well here relative to the 5800X, and in particular its predecessor, the 11700K. Basically, we're looking at a 9% performance boost over the Ryzen 7 part, and then 21% over the 11700K, so another impressive round of results for Intel. Like Cinebench R23, the code compilation results are just brutal for AMD. Here the 12700KF delivered 44% more performance than the 5800X, and even managed to edge out the more expensive 5900X, as it was just 12% slower than the Core i9 12900K. It's also incredible to see a 36% generational leap from the 11700K. The Blender Open Data benchmark is another bloodbath, with the 12700K beating the 5800X by a 31% margin with 5900X-like performance. We're also once again looking at over a 30% improvement from Intel's previous generation counterpart. Okay, so here's a look at power consumption for the Blender benchmark, and when compared to the 12900K, the Core i7 model looks a lot more efficient. We see when compared to the 5900X, the 12900K pushed total system usage 50% higher for just 11% greater performance. The 12700KF, on the other hand, pushed total system usage 24% higher than the 5800X, but delivered 31% more performance. So therefore, it was more efficient than the Ryzen 7 processor, and that's pretty crazy turnaround given what we saw from the Core i9 model. Okay, so let's get serious with some gaming benchmarks, and we'll start with F1 2021. Here we've got some mixed results, as the 12700KF was 8% faster than the 5800X for the 1% low result, but 3% slower for the average frame rate. Technically, that would be a win for Intel, I suppose, though both CPUs pushed well over 250 FPS at minimum, so needless to say, they are both exceptionally good performers. AMD did win the Rainbow Six Siege testing, beating the 12700KF by a mere 3% margin, so again, gaming performance between these two CPUs looks to be nearly identical, at least based on the two titles that we've seen so far. And it really is more of the same with Borderlands 3. The 5800X and 12700KF are close enough to call a tie, so there's no real winner here. In fact, we're so GPU bound with these high-end CPUs that the 12900K was really no faster either. Here the 12700KF did budge ahead, at least for the average frame rate, by a 5% margin, which is still rather insignificant, and the 1% low performance was basically identical. So even in a relatively CPU-intensive game such as Watch Dogs Legion, we're looking at comparable performance between these two processors. Next up we have Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy, and this is a heavily GPU limited title when running with high-end CPUs. So again, the 5800X and 12700KF delivered the same level of performance, which was also comparable to other high-end CPUs such as the 12900K. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is about the most CPU demanding game we have to test with, especially in the village section of the game that we use. Here the 12700KF was 4% faster than the 5800X when comparing the average frame rate, but 2% slower for the 1% low. Either way though, performance was much the same between these two competing parts. The new Core i7 processor was outright faster in Hitman 3, though the margins aren't exactly extreme with the 12700KF up to 4% faster than the 5800X. So once again, we're finding that despite the often massive difference in core-heavy applications, gaming performance is much the same. Well, this is interesting. The new Age of Empires 4 game was up to 27% faster when running on the 12700KF opposed to the 5800X, and this is seen when looking at the 1% low result. Meanwhile, the average frame rate was boosted by 19%, and that's really a massive win for Intel. And it does make me wonder, is this how these two processors might stack up in the future as games continue to become increasingly CPU demanding? Another fairly GPU-limited game is Horizon Zero Dawn, again when using these high-end CPUs. That said, this time the 5800X did take the lead, beating the new 12700KF by a 5% margin. Not exactly a devastating difference, but this one was a win for AMD. Unfortunately, despite being another CPU-demanding game, Cyberpunk 2077 is also extremely GPU-demanding, even with the dialed-down quality settings that we're using here. As a result, the 12700KF matched the majority of the high-end CPUs featured in this test. Now, when it comes to power draw while gaming, we see very little difference between the CPUs tested, whereas the 12700KF pushed total system usage 31% higher in Blender. Here we're looking at just a 5% increase over the 5800X when gaming. So again, it would seem that, for now at least, gamers need not concern themselves with CPU power draw, assuming they're mostly just gaming and not also running core-heavy applications, though as we've seen the 12700KF also does very well there anyway. Okay, so here's a look at the 10-game average data, and as expected based on what we just saw, Intel is ahead of AMD, but only by a mere 1.5% margin for the average frame rate, and then 3% for the 1% low. So as I said in my 12900K review, for the most part, there's really no difference in gaming performance between most of these high-end CPUs, and you'll almost always be entirely GPU limited in today's games, even with an RTX 3090 or 6900 XT at 1080p using dialed down quality settings. Some of the larger margins, like what we're seeing in Age of Empires 4, will evaporate almost entirely when jumping up to 1440p. So when it comes to CPUs and gaming performance, good enough really is enough. Now, when it comes to operating temperatures, the Core i7 12700KF was tested inside the Corsair Obsidian 500D with the glass doors closed. And then for the cooler itself, I've gone with the MSI Core Liquid S360, as it's the only official LGA 1700 cooler that I have, and here we see that the Core i7 processor peaked at 79 degrees after 30 minutes of looping the Cinebench R23 multi-core test. So it is quite hot, but it's also considerably better than the 96 degrees the 12900K ran at under the same test conditions. Well, the Core i7 at 12700KF really is something, and I've got to say, very impressive job, Intel. Sure, you can say that the Ryzen 7 5800X is a year old now, and while that is true, it doesn't really change the fact that the 12700KF is an impressive CPU that often destroys the 5800X in all-core workloads, like what we're seeing in Cinebench, Chromium, Blender, and basically any other application that leans heavily on these CPUs. In fact, it's not just multi-core applications. The mighty strong single-core performance of Alder Lake makes it a weapon for applications such as Adobe After Effects and Photoshop, for example. Then, when it comes to gaming performance, the 12700KF was very strong and did show great potential in titles such as Age of Empires 4. That said, the gains over the 5800X, they weren't exactly amazing, pretty minimal really, and not enough to sway gamers one way or the other. Of course, if you're already rocking an older AM4 system using something like the Ryzen 5 2600 on a B450 motherboard, which was a very popular combo, you're not going to bother with Alder Lake, as buying a Zen 3 CPU is the obvious path there. Moreover, those running a 10th or 11th gen core processor, or really any previous Intel processor for that matter, won't simply be able to upgrade to Alder Lake on their existing motherboard. So then, Alder Lake is for new PC builders, those doing away with their existing platform for something completely new. That being the case, if I were looking at a complete platform upgrade with around $400 to spend on the CPU, which way would I go? 5800X or 12700KF? The first thing I do is look at motherboard pricing, and we already know we're going to ignore DDR5 with the 12700KF, as it's simply not worth paying around 3 times more for the memory. Assuming you are happy with a fairly basic motherboard, the MSI Pro Z690A can be had for $230 US right now, and that's about $70 US more than the equivalent X570 boards such as the Asus TUF Gaming X570 Plus. Pricing between those two models is also very similar in Australia, with the Z690 board costing around 40% more. So it would seem that Z690 pricing is yet to settle in. And if we take those figures, the 5800X with the X570 motherboard comes to around $550 US, whereas the 12700KF with a comparable Z690 motherboard is more like $660 US. So is the Intel package worth 20% more? I'd say for productivity, where it was often well over 20% faster, yes, it is worth it. The Core i7 at 12700K is the way to go. Having said that, the Ryzen 9 5900X on the same X570 TUF Gaming motherboard is just $30 US more than the 12700KF combo, and it was certainly comparable in terms of productivity performance. So really, you could go either way, but I think the 12700KF is a little more balanced with its strong single-core performance, at least on those big P cores. And then when it comes to gaming, the 5800X and 12700KF are again very evenly matched, and there really is no winner here. I can't even tell you which option I'd be most likely to go with, as I just don't know. I could see myself happily gaming with either of these CPUs and their supporting platforms. Therefore, arguing over which is the best gaming CPU, it's a complete waste of time and energy. So I'm going to leave that to the good men and women of Reddit to work out, using their well-measured, reasoned, and considerate approach that Reddit users are so well known for. Definitely getting downvoted for that one. Quickly moving on then. For everyone else, it's going to come down to pricing in your region, for not just the CPUs, but also the motherboards. Then, of course, your use case is also very important. For example, will you be mixing productivity with gaming? And if so, does one CPU offer a performance advantage in your particular application or applications? Obviously, for stuff like code compilation work, rendering, or really any other CPU-intensive task, the Core i7 12700KF is the obvious option. And for AMD to turn that around, they're probably going to need to do some price cuts, and that is something they could very easily do, should they feel the need. And I suppose that will depend on how CPU sales look for the Red team over the next few days, weeks, and months, so on and so forth. And that's going to do it for this look at the new Core i7 12700KF. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like. And I'd also like to give our Patreon and Floatplane members a big thank you for supporting this content, because without them, this just wouldn't be possible. On that note, if you'd like to support the channel and become a Hardware Unboxed community member, get some pretty awesome perks in return, then check out Floatplane and Patreon. Links for those are in the video description. You get access to exclusive content, behind-the-scenes content, Q&As, an exclusive Discord server. We have a very cool Discord server. Tim and myself are active in there. And of course, we do a monthly live stream each month for those members. You can chat to us live and we'll address your questions there. But that's going to do it for this video. Hope you enjoyed it. I'm your host, Steve, and I'll see you again next time.